in battery costs, which is likely to continue over the next few years. And this is a curve drawing from multiple sources, but all of them converge to say that that drop will be substantial and will start really bringing the differential between ICE versus electric buses much closer. Let's move to a second driver. So next slide, please. When you look at beyond the economics, there's still a very big upfront cost to be faced as you decide to procure the charging, the more expensive bus and the like. And today we can say that the bus system in India has not quite figured out how to fund sustainably the provision of bus services. So on one side, you do have revenues from customers that cover part of the cost, but the remainder, the subsidies that are provided in a predictable fashion over the long term that allows, a sustained quality service delivery has not been really sorted out yet in most cities in India. And without it, it becomes very difficult to actually undertake a large program of electrification because the long-term financing is not secure. No, previous slide, please. So as you, previous slide, please. As you look then at the COVID effect, what you will see is that already before the STUs were not financially viable. But with COVID, you're going to see more or less a doubling of a deficit associated with service provision. So it means that STUs do not have the funding yet fully sorted out, and currently they are faced with a crunch that is unusual. So this is an important element to address moving forward. Okay, so coming to this slide on your screen, the second part of the equation is if you think about a 2 to 6 lakh crore investment required from the private sector, it's very clear that it's not going to be a single solution fits all for the entire of India. Ultimately, GCC is certainly a powerful solution, but there needs to be a way of thinking, how do you crowd in leasing that are more financial lease providers that would be looking at long-term returns associated with the provision of the fleet against a fixed rate per kilometer. There is also, because the major cost differential between an ICE and an electric bus comes from the battery, there are attempts in other countries to separate the cost of a battery and lease essentially the battery to the operator so that it becomes essentially a stream of cost spread over time, much more like a fuel cost essentially. Next, there is an opportunity to think about a role of aggregator, a little bit like SECI in the energy sector or DISCOM in Latin American countries, where the bus and batteries are provided to operators for lease. Yes?
Anji.
Okay, so moving to the next slide, the third key drivers that will make define the pace of adoption comes from the complexities associated with electric bus versus diesel buses. On the right-hand side, 4 of the key parameters that a diesel bus planning authority or operator needs to think of, and on the left-hand side, the electric buses. The level of complexity is very, very different. And when level of complexity differs that much, it means you need to train your people, bring new tools, develop the thinking, and pilots are very good for that. But to bring it at a full scale, you're going to need to train a lot of people in order to be able to optimize battery size, battery life cycle, time of charging, and the like. So how does one look at this and move forward? Well, first, by looking from the perspective of what is happening, the STUs and the FAME2 program, as well as a future batch of tendering by STUs, and thinking about how do you improve the tendering, the master concession agreement, and the financing that goes with it. So starting with tendering, it is very clear that this is a new market, and therefore you want to create and foster the emergence of key qualified players that are going to be able to enter bids and are likely to go all the way to the successful conclusion, not only of winning the bid, but actually implementing. We see other countries looking, for example, at pre-qualification as a solution for that. Second, as the system gets planned, it's very essential to think about the total cost of ownership, including the cost of electricity, to foster greater efficiency on a life cycle basis for the overall operation. Next is, to a large extent, the complexity I was showing on the institutional side have not been reflected in the technical and functional specification being provided to bidders. They don't quite know which routes they would be using the buses on, which depot will be used. And if you don't know that, you cannot actually accurately calculate your TCO. If you cannot calculate your TCO, you cannot provide a very competitive bid, because you're going to need to create a lot of additional margin just to be safe in case the wrong application is being picked. So as part of this, there is a need for a consultative process during the tender process to ensure that the parameters are as clear as possible and the timelines are consistent with the level of complexity associated. Next slide, please. Oh, okay, you skip one, and next slide. Okay, so now coming to the master concession agreement. I mean, it was certainly great to see an effort at creating a master concession agreement. We actually reviewed it as part of an engagement with the Ministry of Road Transport and Highways, and it has a lot of good features. But when discussing with the industry about the master concession agreement, we can find that there are features in the concession agreement that substantially increase the cost associated with their implementation. So whether it's the duration of the concession agreement, whether it's the need to provide a guarantee to cover the FAMES 2 subsidies, or whether it's about creating a structure that can evolve juridically so that investors come in and out based on their risk return profile and aspiration, are things that can be tweaked to make the master concession agreement much more attractive and reduce the cost associated with that. A second element is related to payment terms. There is a great distrust, and I dare to say that, in terms of will you be paid for the contract you enter into. And this is true of diesel buses, or it is true even more so of for electric buses, where you have a much higher upfront cost. So the standardization of payment timeline and creation of instrument that guarantees payment becomes quite essential for the costs associated with service delivery to be reasonable. Last but not least, and again, this is something that applies for both electric buses and diesel buses, is when defining the service level agreement, the penalties, the risk and responsibility distribution, there is a tendency to have a one-sided set of requirements tilted towards the STU that does create a risk factor that is simply priced by bidders. So coming to next slide, I think when you then put all of this together, it boils down to the question of access to financing and bankability of the contracts you put on the market as STU. On one side, you have a tender and an MCA, and then on the other side, the operators, OEM, are going to need to go to the banks and secure fairly large amount of financing to purchase the bus to enter into those contracts. As you do that, what happens is that in India today, the operators have a fairly weak balance sheet altogether from a commercial banking perspective. So they are not really very much able, on the base of their balance sheet, to secure a lot of financing from banks. OEM have a different position. They tend to be with higher credit rating, at least before the crisis, but they are not necessarily keen to be long-term part or principals in the provision of bus services. So if it's not financing secured through balance sheet metrics, then the commercial banks will look at what is the certainty of the cash flow associated with a contract that you're entering into. Here, there is a track record that is mixed and maybe even a bit negative in terms of whether or not cash flow have been secured and continued over time in the past when GCC contracts were entered into. So creating instruments that guarantee those flow, providing maybe a payment guarantee from a third party, government party, can be quite essential to create a cash flow certainty that will then allows the bidders or the contracted parties to approach a commercial bank and secure financing. Last but not least, things do happen in the scope of a 10, 12 years or 15-year contract. And, I think it's certainly true when you consider COVID, but it's true otherwise as well. So what is your secondary market for the vehicle that would allow, a termination of a contract in ways that does not, totally destroy the financial standing of an operator entering a contract becomes quite essential. So if I was to summarize, from a private sector operator deciding to come into that market, the risk sharing, the termination aspect, and the payment certainty become absolutely key assets for them to secure financing from banks. Next slide, please. So in summary, if you were, next slide, please. So in summary, if you were to look at what can be done in the context of STUs trying to go forward with contracting out new electric buses, an opportunity to think about how do you optimize the tendering process, an opportunity to think how you fix some of the elements in the master concession agreement that do increase the cost substantially. And with that, providing essentially an improved access to finance to the bidders who are then going to be able to give you better offers. And as you work on creating a qualified market, you will start seeing more bidders emerging. Currently, you often have one or two bidders only on the same two contracts, which will bring competitive pricing and will start moving in the direction of this robust growing e-bus market. So that's really relevant in the context of the STUs and the creation of a market that would allow the leveraging of financing. The last thing is that if you think now about intercity bus operation, we are starting to see some private operators who are investing in e-buses for intercity. There is quite a number of good applications simply because, again, the saving comes from lower fuel price. And because of this lower fuel price, you can really optimize the intercity market quite substantially, where fuel price is a much higher percentage of your total cost compared to urban services. But what is then critical is to think about how and where the charging facilities will be in those respective cities, and whether private operators flying across those cities will be able to have access to those charging infrastructure. So here again, a new business model that one can consider that fosters the development of bus charging facilities and terminal that would be open for public and private operators and allow the market to explore that other market segment. So, in a nutshell, the 2 to 6 lakh crore market is going to be a real opportunity. The path towards this is going to really require some tweaking of the system on the financial perspective, on the institutional perspective, and on the procurement and contracting perspective. Thank you. Dr. Singh, I'm done with the presentation. Huh?
Thank you so much for your presentation, Gerald. We have now Dr. Sajid with us, who will take forward the last bit. We are running short of time, and I'm really sorry for the technical error. Dr. Sajid, over to you. You can share your screen and take it forward.
Yeah, I'll share my screen. How much time do we have? This is about 12, nearing 12:10. So, is it half an hour we have?
Uh, Sir, actually, we are running short of time, but may I request you if you could just wind off in 10 minutes so that we could answer some questions.
All right. So, but it seems my sharing is disabled. Can you do that then?
Sure. You may share your screen.
All right. Okay. Is it visible now?
Yes, it is visible.
Okay. So, good afternoon. Now, I have to speak about what is left to speak because in the same space, I don't think there is much to be said. What the CEO has outlined the very positive aspect that in spite of everything, there is a recovery seen. In spite of the decline pre-COVID and then the COVID decline, but there seems to be a robust thing because people need to travel. And this doubt about whether people will still travel in buses after COVID, it depends on the kind of bus you provide. So that's not something I can really speak about. Mr. General spoke about it. Then Gerald has talked about the financing things totally. So now, my first slide here, the opening slide, kind of says this is a very simple concept I want to present. Make for India and EV bus for the tropics. So I don't need to speak much because these are felt things. People know it in terms of buses, particularly. Almost everything comes from outside, but it is not very bad. The first experience competing with the global leaders, we have found that we have. I was surprised at the kind of numbers Gerald told me, spoke about. I thought we were in a bad shape, but looks like our companies haven't done too bad in the total, the buses being rolled out by FAME. But the second issue, Make for India, I think will happen because the volumes are there. The bus is the biggest thing. Like, for example, in the last 3 months, 2,000 scooters got sold. I think that many buses are getting sold. This is a very strange situation. 400 cars, 4,500 auto rickshaws. I mean, bus seems to be the real big thing out here. But the issue of EV bus for the tropics, that needs some attention because Dr. General talked about 26% of the energy being consumed by air conditioning for people, the cabin. But that's not the only thing which is air conditioned. In an electric bus, underneath the bus also it's air conditioned. Very seriously, it's refrigerated. It has to be seriously kept at 25 degrees, nothing more than that, uh, because that's what is required to run the bus. The batteries we use. So that's a big issue. We need to talk about it a little bit, and that has to be make for India because very few people may have this problem. Most of the places where the bus or electric vehicles are introduced in the world are in the tropical regions. And in fact, they're very happy with the battery. 25 degrees, normal temperature, is what is expected. The battery expects, and that you get it. But in India, it's 10 degrees more at any point of time. And the battery efficiency dramatically reduces. That's on the one hand. And there are, I think, broadly three kinds of batteries. So I have promised my talk will be technical. The title itself says. So without any apology, I'm getting in there. I did look at the participants list, and I found there are people who know much more about this subject in terms of technology than I would be. But then I expect the rest of them to even out and not know too much. So let's talk a little bit about technology. Let's talk about how all of these things which Garal talked about. For example, one of those things he mentioned is, in terms of the level of complexity is high. Uh, so he was talking in a different sense, but all of that, for me, it looks at the same thing. Then he talked about battery size, life cycle, type of charging, one category. The range of the vehicle, seating capacity, body relates to the size of the thing which has to be carried. And then the idle time, location of charging stations. These are about opportunity charging or what kind of a charging you do. And the requirement for climate management, the I forgot I was on camera. I was and energy for the AC required and the space for charging. These are the issues which he talked about. They all relate to uh, battery and charging. Putting charge into the battery, it's very much related. The other aspect of it, of course, is the motor. So let me just, instead of beating around the bush, let's go to the subject here. So it seems electric buses are at an inflection point. Not just electric buses, even electric cars. We heard of Tesla so much, but now the smaller cars are getting lapped up in, that's a word being used in newspapers, lapped up by uh, in Germany and France, huge number of sales, and these are not very fancy cars. It is like the Renault Zoe and all of that. We have in China we have about 4 lakh buses, which is about 98% of the buses, and it seems it's going to be like that. If you look at the numbers from Europe, 4,000 electrified buses. They're counting everything in there, including the hybrids and the fuel cell and everything. That is not a big number, but more surprising is that that number is 20% of annual sales of buses, which means that's not a market you really look for buses to grow much, though Europe depends a lot on buses. Somehow, it's not that kind of numbers which we see here. In the US, it is no seen at all, 0.5% of the market so far. That's way too low for it to get anywhere. In India, the numbers are different. Some people talk about 1 lakh. CEO talked about 1 lakh. I've seen references from some global things about 75,000, but looks like more like 50,000 buses sold every year. Even then, a small conversion, it's quite significant. And while we are at it, the FAME has done a good job. I saw Ambu Sharmaji here in this list. He said the ball rolling. Now we are talking about 7,000 buses. This is global size volume. And obviously, at this point of time, we cannot choose what technologies we can go for. But there is a need for choice. This is why I'm saying that. And I assume most buses are from BYD, but I find that Photon is there. Probably it is a bus very similar to BYD because both technologies exist in China. As I go on, I'll say. And Tata Motors is the other big one out there. But let's focus on BYD because having to face BYD, which is a technology intensive company, and having to struggle to hold on to your market is a good thing for our companies. In the process, it looks like Ashok Leyland and JBM got pushed out of the court itself, but they're doing great stuff as a result in terms of technology. They're trying to kind of work out different options which they would not have if they got the orders easily. So, what is a BYD bus? First of all, it's carrying 3 tons of battery or more. Because it's a battery company, they can put a lot of battery on board. But the battery they use is actually tropical friendly. It is among the 3 batteries which is there. This battery doesn't use nickel and cobalt, and it is comparatively safer, but it still needs cooling. Without cooling, the efficiency goes down, but it is not really going to explode that easily. The big thing about the BYD, this is a world-class vehicle with the motor sitting inside the wheel itself. It is a hub motor. And you have this bus carrying its own charger. 80 kilowatt charger is carrying around. This is the kind of bus we have arrived here. And these companies are competing and survive, it's amazing. So our companies are getting, the domestic companies are having an accelerated learning curve, and they seem to be doing well. That is why I would like to kind of carry out the conversation, which I kind of want to engage in the next couple of slides. So essentially, BYD carries its own charging apparatus. And the paradigm is you charge the whole night, and the battery is big enough that they can run the whole day, which is all right for BYD and the kind of a thing they do. Although, in a way, it is strange that you carry 3 tons of battery up and down the city for a dozen times a day. That looks a bit odd to me, but if that makes sense, it is all right. But what doesn't make sense is utility saying that this is exactly the vehicle they want. I saw the presentation from Bangalore, STU, one of the leading ones. They just want this bus only. They don't want any other bus, which is very strange. I think it's a very uneducated way of going about it, saying that you want exactly 3 tons of battery and you want a bus which doesn't require a charging infrastructure, and you want the bus to run non-stop whole day, although it is just running the same strip up and down. Now, there is something very specific about buses which are critical, which are so good for electrifying. One is that the bus, a city bus, we are not talking about intercity bus, even that is well defined in terms of its routes. But a city bus certainly has a very specific route, and that route doesn't change for years. In fact, the number of people who get on board in the bus may be the same most of the time. Its energy use is predictable. And city bus operations are energy efficient because you don't race too much, you don't decelerate too fast. The bus is not supposed to kind of race around the way, it creates chaos. It's supposed to run very calmly. City buses, that's what you expect. And regenerative braking is possible because every other few kilometers you have a bus stop. So, and generally you find 40 kilometers is the outer limit, unless you take the Delhi's ring road or something like that. 40 kilometers is really the outer limit. At the lower limit, you might have a bus trip which is less than 10 kilometers, which is a real thing I've seen in Kerala. Other places, Delhi, I think it's about 35, which is on the higher side. Everywhere else, 20, 25 kilometers is the bus trip length. And after trip, there is a procedural thing that there has to be a break. Of course, some places the break may be rather short, but a break is required for certain administrative purposes, to kind of account and all of that. So it's possible that you can have small charges during the day, several times a day. Now, which is good for the battery because battery doesn't like really extreme things. You can, of course, lithium-ion batteries' particular benefit is that you can really go deep discharge, not too much, but within a limit, and you can go nearly up to to the top. Of course, you have to leave 10-20% free both sides, but 80% of the battery almost is available for you, which is not the case with other batteries. Now, there is an alternative. This is why I said it is not what has been said that BYD model is the only model. There is a very strong model from China itself. There is a company called Microvast. There are other companies as well. I'm just taking this one up just to say that a bus battery can be charged in 20 minutes. It's actually possible to charge even faster, but then some compromise happens, and then the battery may not be able to hold too much of energy. So it's quite possible that a bus could charge in 20 minutes. It is not necessary to charge the whole night. And this happens to be the two paradigms we need to talk about. So in that kind of a situation where you're talking about charging a bus quite rapidly, would be like buses standing in a queue underneath a structure like this. They come in a queue, stand for 20 minutes, charge full, go off. If you want to charge it full. If you're not charging full, if you're just charging for the trip, maybe a bit lesser, but that much time is okay to allow. And so this is the other paradigm, and this is what is being called as opportunity charging. Though, of course, another way of looking at opportunity charging is charge wherever you go, like in a bus stop. And well, that's carrying it to the extreme. Charging every trip makes sense because you don't have to carry excess battery around. You only size it for what you want. And carrying around 3.5. In fact, U-Town bus I thought was carrying 422 kilowatt hour. I don't know, that may be about 4 tons. That's a lot of battery to carry around. And first of all, we don't have that kind of ability to kind of this is the same battery you have on your telephone. Imagine 3-ton, 4-ton battery and putting it on one bus. And it obviously people cannot get on board. Buses have to be lighter, vehicles have to be lighter. So in India, of course, we need to look at opportunity charging. We need to look at standardization of the whole situation, which are not what really is happening today. For example, the topics being mentioned, Mr. Singh told me the topics to talk about today are one thing about assessing the current situation. Then he was very worried about standardizing of charging. Now, the people at the helm today do not want standardizing of charging, which is quite strange. Strange in the long term. In the short term, it is okay. For the purposes of fame, it is all right that you give people freedom and it may work. But if you talk about, like Gerald said, about a lakh or 2 lakh buses, then it is not possible to reach that scale without a standardized way of handling these buses. For everybody's sake, standardization is not just for the operator, it's for the manufacturer, it is for everybody involved in the chain. Even the suppliers also need to kind of know what is a real thing to meet, the standard to meet. So, how does this work? This one looks a bit strange. You see that thing on top, the inverted cone, and the bus carries the pantograph. So, essentially, it is not too different. I have looked at the international standard. There are variations of this. This is called the automated charger, automated connection mechanism. There are variations of CHAdeMO, GPT, and CCS. It just happens instead of that hosepipe connection, we're using this connection. So it is not going too far away. And there is a tendency there is a new move by CHAdeMO and CCS, which are quite similar systems, to converge onto a newer thing, which is a cable-based connector. So these are the new things emerging. In terms of buses, the standardization should look a little bit forward to what is happening globally. And those are not yet final. These standards are still being worked upon globally. One is the connector system, the hose pipe system. Uh, One could liquid cool it, which is what is happening in the CCS system. You could use a much stronger, thicker, bigger connector out there, a simplified one. It's called CHAOG, and that is what the CHAdeMO and GBT are together doing. It is meant for bus kind of systems, big systems. Or you could have a pantograph of this kind, and that is not all. You can have a pillar kind of a thing coming from the ground to connect, or you can have something on the side as a rail or a connector on the side. Like there are things like the electrified roads. So that's the direction where things are going, and we need to be there. And opportunity charging is required because all said and done, 3 tons is okay. But if you want to have a longer trip, you cannot carry. This is the limit of what you can carry as a bus. Uh, so coming back to our key thing about, so I just made a case that there has to be a standardization of charging infrastructure, and those standards are not going to kind of say it has to be a pantograph. It will include a pantograph. It will include all 3 things I said. So there is no need for anybody to get alarmed that things are going to get standardized. All it means, like say CHAdeMO, CCS, and GBT exists in a standard. So standardization has not taken away anybody's freedom. In fact, everything is there. It is just a systematic way of doing things. So the 3 options for buses are a cable which is cooled, a cable which has got a higher throughput, or a system of like this, which is an automated system, so that the charging mechanism is not a person doesn't get involved, and buses can stand in a queue, rapidly charge, and go off. So that's about the charging. But what is to be charged? That determines what kind of charger you use. There are 2 kinds of batteries which are suitable for buses in India. Because of the higher temperatures, you really cannot use any other battery today. Of course, there are new batteries the DST is promoting a technology program. We have studied it. We are certain that these batteries are going to change. Next 5 years is going to kind of new batteries are going to come up. Uh, so lithium iron phosphate, which is now used, and lithium titanate oxide are the 2 batteries suitable for buses. There is a very interesting thing about these 2 batteries, other than the fact that they are safer. Out of them, lithium titanate is much more safer. Uh, they're both temperature tolerant, but the more interesting thing is they will meet our strategic goals in terms of material availability. Lithium iron phosphate still need it's better in terms of you see you don't have cobalt and nickel in there. In lithium titanate oxide, you might use cobalt and nickel. So these are the 2 battery systems which meet several of our goals, and they're good for our bus systems. Iron phosphate, because of safety features, because it is non-toxic, it uses iron and these properties of stability and safety. And it performs almost equally as those other batteries which you have. Titanate oxide, because This is the battery which will be assisting us in the opportunity charging. For example, if people are familiar with this Samsung Galaxy Note 10, the new thing with the stylus, that stylus has a lithium titanate oxide battery. It charges so rapidly, you have to insert the stylus into into the place which is provided, and you take it out, it's charged already. It is that fast. So this battery can charge, say, 10 times faster than the other batteries. And the reason I've given you in the first thing itself is that it's got a lot of surface area, and it's good for acceleration. It can even give 10,000 cycles at 25 degrees. Surprisingly, if you push it up to 55 degrees, still it works very well. I'm emphasizing on that because in India, we have a company producing titanium in bulk. It is a PSU. It is Travancore Titanium Company Limited. They are working with ISRO, and they are very keen to form a consortium and get into the production of lithium titanate battery. This is a very encouraging thing, but you don't have to go so far. The first battery plant which is coming up in the country is LTO, which is being put up by Maruti, the consortium led by Maruti. We need to look at this battery. The issue with this battery is it has to be charged often, but that's not a constraint for a public charging system. So I don't want to get into too much detail. I'm saying these are the two battery systems which are required in the country. And lithium iron phosphate, of course, is produced in China in really big bulk. LTO has really no takers. It could become the India battery, and we have an advantage. We are in a position to have the raw materials under control, a company which is specialized in titanium, and we also have a large group of scientists who are good in nanotechnology today. It is a successful program run by the government. We are quite good in terms of, in rough comparison, we can say we are about third or fourth in the world in terms of number of people we have available in this kind of field. So you really have people who can work on the battery and make it good. Now, this is my final slide. E-bus is a way of pushing out a lot of battery as well. So that is why BYD is there. They may have gotten there, but now, of course, they're a big bus company. Yutong has even bigger battery. So my point about here in the side is the second part. That is, you have this large battery manufacturing mission. The government made one attempt, which didn't go very well, to try and find a market for it. It was suggested that the entire two-wheeler population can be shifted to the electric mode. And it didn't go too well. People protested, but the intent was this, to create a market. Otherwise, it's not really going to take off. The 50 gigawatt of battery facility, which is being commissioned now, the mission, I think it is much better to tie to the electric bus, because bus is actually a Trojan horse for battery. It carries a lot of battery. Whether you go for the 3-ton variety or you go for the fast charging variety, even then it's not going to be less than a ton of battery per bus. And you're talking about a lakh of bus or more. So this mission, in my opinion, should not be all that agnostic. It should look at the tropical climate. It should look at the e-bus, which we need to deploy in bulk scale. And of course, their approval process, the criteria are all there. They're all very agnostic. But it is still possible within that scheme for people to take initiative and create a large bus battery manufacturing program in the country, because the demand is visible, demand is there, and the government is in a position to influence the demand. I think I should stop here so that I can allow some time for question answer if that's possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mubashir. My name is Jan de Man. I work for the Busworld Academy. I'm taking over since Dr. Singh has been disconnected from the internet by now. So thank you to all the speakers. We have had a very interesting webinar on the way to electric buses. But in previous webinars and in upcoming webinars, we will also have to pay attention to the position of CNG, LNG, which is already working right now, especially on longer distance travels. And we also have to note that the evolution of hydrogen worldwide is evolving as well. Now, maybe a question to Mr. Oliver from the World Bank. Do you think that the TCO of the three different technologies, I'm talking about CNG, I'm talking about electric, and I'm talking about hydrogen, will come closer to each other, so that the choice in the fuel that will have to be made will not only be depending on the price, on the TCO, but on the specificities of the trips that have to be made. Everybody is quite convinced by now that those three fuels will be complementary, that it will be not the one or the other. Is the TCO really coming closer? Do you have any experiences in the World Bank with this, Ms. Ross?
So thanks for the question. And I would like to also thank Dr. Mubashir for the presentation before, because it's quite useful to get that perspective on opportunities that reflect the local condition and so on. The TCO question is something that keeps evolving very, very fast. And I think the reason is simply the curve of transformation of those technologies as they come at scale is changing the equilibrium. So, anybody who makes a projection is bound to be incorrect, more or less. So I will just mention the following. I think when it comes to hydrogen, it's certainly a technology that has some potential, but it seems, given the pace of development, the infrastructure requirement, etc., it may be a bit further down the road in terms of the full equilibrium. And it may be more something you see in the next decade than in this decade in some ways, not to work as a technology, but to be able to move at full scale and be part of the mainstream options looking at. I think I looked recently at some of the projections that were carried out by Bloomberg, and they were looking at, by 2040, maybe 10-20% would be coming from hydrogen in particular, but not too much by 2030. I don't know if they get it right or not, but the bottom line is certainly an important technology, but it will take a bit more R&D and testing of the scalability to see that it's taking a big market share. Electric is a bit different in the sense that we can foresee that the TCO will certainly be competitive very rapidly on some of the market segment. And then the question becomes, can you figure out financial solution to make the upfront cost similar? Once you have done that, then the rationale becomes very clear as to moving in that direction. For CNG, we're actually looking at it in parallel. So it's a bit early. I don't have detailed data to share with you. So I like to speak on things I've studied in details. Certainly, it's one of the technologies to consider. We have seen a big change with the BS6 being introduced on diesel that also makes it certainly a technology worth looking at, even from an environmental perspective, given those buses have now achieved much better environmental performance, even though the TCO is a bit higher.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. This is very clear indeed. And I think this will also be the evolution worldwide, not only in India, but the rest of the world will certainly follow that scheme as well. Allow me a last question to Dr. Jindal. A very important influencer of the TCO of the electric buses that Tata is delivering is the charging infrastructure, right? If we go to opportunity charging, which means charging during the trips, maybe on the road, there's a very different scheme from overnight charging in the depot. It was mentioned during the webinar that the implementation of opportunity charging in India is slowing down. Do you feel, as Tata, that the evolution or the introduction of electromobility will mainly be based on depot charging, which means that the operators themselves invest in the charging infrastructure in their depots? Is that the vision of Tata, or is it more moderate? Dr. Jindal?
Yeah, I think it's not necessarily the vision of Tata Motors that we want only depot charging, but this is what, as I shared during webinar, this is what based on the way the tenders are being written and the way what is the feeling of the users, they are very comfortable with the overnight charging. They don't want the bus to come to a charging point during the day and then be charged by somebody and then sent back again on this route. If they have their say, they will all want depot charging. It's so what I mentioned was primarily what we are hearing from the operators, not necessarily that this is the vision of Tata Motors. So Tata Motors is responding to that need by offering higher battery capacity so that they can always try to maximize their running during the day. They don't have to come back to, but as I mentioned in one of the slides, it has got its challenges, that how much energy you can put it in the vehicle. One is your cost of battery, the another is your weight which you add to the vehicle. So they are the technical challenges. Obviously, maybe in future when we have got much higher energy density, as now we are hearing from LFP, you can have more higher energy density, then you can put it more. NMC, in fact, we in Tata Motors, we started with NMC only.
Nice.
And we still use NMC to put as much as energy. So I think the short answer is it's not that Tata Motor is driving only overnight charging. It is what the customers are very comfortable with. Of course, we'll have to do a trade-off between the battery size and the range in single charge.
Yeah, I understand that what you will be delivering will be following the demand. But I also understand that the demand for overnight charging in India might come in faster than the opportunity charging itself.
Correct.
One last question before we close this session. Allow me to come back to Mr. Oliver as well. The financing of the implementation of electric buses in India in a STU or a very big company with fleets over 1,000 buses is very different from the implementation in smaller, middle-sized companies. What is the World Bank actually offering to that second category, to let's say the bus companies with a fleet lesser than 1,000 buses? Is there a service from the World Bank as well on that level? Can operators in India refer to the World Bank for this?
So, naturally, the World Bank group, which includes the World Bank and IFC, are looking at it a bit differently. On my side, from the World Bank side, we look at creating the policy and regulatory environment that is going to allow that private sector to emerge and the public sector to deliver service. And our sister organization, with which we are really working very closely on that topic, is looking at how to support private operators in the making of those transactions. At the end, it does boil down to the TCO, the financial feasibility, including the funding. And we are seeing, for example, some interest in the intercity market from some of the players to develop and to reap the benefits from much lower energy costs associated with those trip by electric vehicle. So, IFC does look at that from the private sector perspective, and we are working as part of the transformative mobility and battery storage program on thinking through the entire system holistically and seeing how you get to scale, right? I mean, I think there's no question that small pilots can be done, even bigger pilots can be done. The question is, what will it take to really get to the 25% by 2030? That's a goal, because it's not going to happen by miracle. The amounts are big. It takes a full industry to respond to that. It requires fixing the service delivery in ways that are sustainable.
But we also understand that the strategies towards the STUs and the very big private companies is different than the ones for the, let's say, 80% small and middle-sized enterprises in the market.
Correct. So one thing I would mention, though, is in particular for the small and mid-sized companies, what we see is access to properly located charging infrastructure is very difficult to do by themselves. if you have 1,000 buses, you can most likely afford to build a charging depot or the like. If you have 20 buses, that's not something you can think of, right? Because the time frame is different.
Exactly.
But therefore, that's why I was mentioning at the end of the presentation that if one was to think about terminal and depot for charging open for public and private operators as a service, obviously against charging payment, etc., then that would unlock the smaller private sector operators to come in the market. So that's what I mean by looking at the policy and regulatory side, thinking about what will be the unlocker that then allow them to proceed with the purchase of 20, 30 buses on intercity, most likely, or as part of tenders for some of the municipal contracts.
Thank you very much. I think this is a very relevant conclusion for this webinar. So we hear that we might be looking for a third party, let's say energy suppliers, to as well public as private players, bigger and smaller. That is a very interesting conclusion for this webinar. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to thank all the speakers from NITI, from Tata Group, from the World Bank, and from the Department of Science and Technology. Thank you very much. This was definitely a very interesting webinar. We apologize for the technical problems that we have had. We will work on that and definitely solve it for our next webinar, which will be on August the 6th. And it will be on the future of bus-based public transport systems. How do different parties look at public transport services, let's say in a scope 3, 5 to 10 years in India from now? I will conclude here by saying that the answers to the questions will all be available, as well as the recording of this session, on the Busworld Academy website. So please look at it, and it will be from somewhere next week onwards, all be available there. Thank you again, and I look forward to meet you all at one of the Busworld's upcoming webinars or at one of our conferences, wherever in the world that may be. Thank you. Hope to see you soon. Bye.
Thank you very much.